Hello, thanks for coming to my talk. I've changed the title a little bit from what I think you saw before in the announcement. The problem with writing titles and abstracts in a rush is that afterwards you think, no, that wasn't a very good title. So I'm hoping that this one sums up a little bit better the themes that I will be covering today. So who of you is working on the analysis, automated analysis of social signals? Okay, so the rest of you are doing something other mysterious but no less great. Who's working on vision-based analysis? Audio? Machine learning only? Okay. So a sort of multimedia type of audience, I guess. Good. This is a good place to start. For everyone who's not doing stuff on social signals, I don't know if you're familiar with it. Can anyone sort of give an indication of their experience with it? Are people in general familiar with social signals? More or less. Okay, well, I will go through this anyway. And So one of the things that I focus on mostly is non-verbal behavior. And from a social psychology perspective, then you can consider non-verbal behavior to be signals that are transmitted from a transmitter to a receiver on the other side, which can be broken down into a number of different dimensions. I'm not going to go too much into those dimensions, but mostly they're related to how you appear, how you express yourself, what is happening to your face, your body, and also how you position yourself relative to other people. Of course, in reality, we're not interested in that, at least not in this building, I guess. We're interested in how we can go from some person doing something to a computer that can analyze that behavior. And the focus for today, I will be looking at vocal behavior, gestures and postures, and essentially space and environment, or how you position yourself relative to your local environment. So what I do in a nutshell, I guess this is probably quite familiar to many people in this room, in the sense that you have some real world data, you extract some raw signals from it. In my case, it could be video, it could be audio, it could be wearable sensor data. And then we do some processing on the signals to extract features. We put that into some pattern recognition or machine learning and evaluate something. In my case, it could be either socially relevant behaviors, like speaking or gesturing, or it could be social relational, in the sense that you're trying to assess the, let's say, relative hierarchy between different people who are talking together. Now, in reality, to make this a solvable solution, we need to have findings from social and behavioral science. And so now I've put this nice box in here with an arrow. So often that's how it could be considered, that this research is about a straight application of knowledge from one domain to another. But in reality, what I find most fascinating is that these findings are not always directly applicable, because what social scientists find out about behavior are not necessarily things that we can robustly estimate as behavior. And so this is actually the interesting interface where, rather than having a straight pattern recognition task, we have something which is sort of a mixture. And actually, because we're looking in this domain and actually in the real world as well, then often we're trying to solve problems that are at the interface where we don't necessarily fully understand the social behavior, and we don't necessarily know how to solve the problem using standard machine learning techniques. So I wanted to show you a picture first. Let's consider this to be multimodal data. At the moment, it's only a single modality. But let's say it exists in the world of multimedia. Can anybody shout out a word that you know, sums up what this meeting, what this picture is?
Anything.
Yeah, okay, very good.
Supervisor student meeting.
Interesting. Anything else? Maybe I've primed you slightly with my wording. So this is actually a well-known figure within the department. This was one of my old lab mates. And I guess when you said supervisor-student meeting, then who were you saying was the student and the supervisor?
Student on the left.
Now, if you didn't know those people, you would probably still say something similar, because there's something about, even in this static image, something about the activity which expresses to you that there is this hierarchy. So, I mean, I'm just showing a few examples here now. You know, they're both looking at each other. This person is talking and expressing themselves quite vigorously. This backwards leaning posture is typically associated with someone who feels comfortable, perhaps, you know, dominating. The distance between them is also quite important for saying what type of relationship they have with each other. And so aside from saying this is an activity which is a meeting, we can talk about the relationships between people, like this person is more dominant, this person is less dominant. So the research questions that I tend to address are about how can we develop techniques to automatically understand social behavior. And well, going back, following from the diagram that I showed you earlier, how can we use findings from social and behavioral sciences to help us to inspire automated methods to solve these problems? And as well as that, if we go into the real world, into the wild, can we solve these problems? How can we solve these problems in settings where, for example, the sensor data is not clean or completely clean, but actually quite noisy? So these are the 4 tasks that I will be presenting today. The first one will be about estimating dominance in meetings. The second one will be about estimating attraction during speed dates. The third one is based on the analysis of mingling scenarios where actually you don't know beforehand who's talking with whom, whereas in the first 2 you would. And then the fourth one is also about analyzing who is talking with whom, but whereas in the third case it will be with video-based approaches, in the fourth case it will be just using a single wearable accelerometer per person. Okay, so firstly, estimating dominance. Now, what's so interesting about dominance? Dominance is something which the social psychologists love to talk about because it's sort of a fundamental construct of how groups and communities form. And so it's related to power, it's related to status, and you know, even the very first time that you meet somebody, there will be already an unconscious, let's say, struggle that is develops as to who is the more dominant out of the two. What's nice about it is that often the person who is dominating can dominate in a less than constructive way. And it would be nice for machines to be able to give us impartial information that tells us, okay, that person is dominating the conversation a bit too much. Maybe they should just dial it down a bit and let other people contribute. Now, going back to this, let's say, rule book or findings from social psychology, then there's a whole bunch of literature out there which expresses the behavior of dominant people with respect to things that we as computer scientists can quite easily extract, or at least there is a link, not perhaps a direct link, but at least a mapping. So the ones that I've highlighted are, I guess, the ones that I've looked at more. For example, talking longer, being kinesically more expressive, so that means like bodily, moving your arms quite a lot, for example, while you gesture. They tend to receive more attention, and also when they express themselves, they tend to look while speaking, whilst when somebody else is talking to them, they won't look at them so much. So you can express actually dominance in terms of a visual dominance ratio. So in terms of the research question that I'm presenting here today, it's about, in meetings, are there certain nonverbal cues that we can use to detect if somebody is dominant or not? And is this possible to do with relatively brief observations? So here we're talking about taking a quite fairly long meeting and then cutting it into 5-minute segments and then trying to predict on a 5-minute segment. Oops. So now typically with this type of work, dominance is partially a subjective thing, especially when you're trying to label data. So that means that in reality, for a data set that we were using, and annotators were asked to annotate the most dominant person in that 4-person meeting, then 57 meetings had 2 out of the 3 annotators that were annotating the meeting saying, okay, this is the person who's dominant. Whereas only 34 had full agreement for the meetings. And so I'm going to show you the results of the 34, the full agreement case. In the journal paper, there is actually, full analysis on all different sorts. Right, yeah. So what I want to do is just show you a little clip of part of the meetings.
And so you will receive further instruction by email.
Can you hear that? It's okay.
Yeah. Yes, master. Do you need to add anything? No. You feel okay? Yeah. You feel free to express what you want to say? You don't feel too constrained? You don't feel free to answer this? Okay, so see you.
So I guess from this clip, then people will already have some judgment about who is the more dominant person. Would anyone say the person in the white t-shirt? And the person in the darker color on the right? Wow, lots of abstentions. Okay. Yeah, well, okay, the abstentions are interesting because they show that here that you maybe detected a hint of sarcasm in there, or a little bit of play, which makes it unclear who's really dominating. This is actually a problem with this particular data set, which is called the AMI data set, because these were meetings where people came together to design a remote control, but the remote control is made out of plasticine because it's a fake scenario, and so people aren't actually truly invested. So this is one of the problems with collecting data for these types of experiments. But often, yes, people will say that this guy is the more dominant, and there are many subtle things that he does to make him appear more dominant. But perhaps one of the most basic cues is the fact that if you look at the turn-taking patterns, then this guy tends to be the one who speaks more. So we conducted many different experiments. I'm just going to show you now a summary, really, to say that we did some stuff with multimodal data, where using headset microphones, then we thresholded the audio energy as a very basic way of expressing speaking status, whether somebody was speaking or not. And then in terms of visual behavior, then as was stated in the social psychology slide, then being kinesically more expressive is a way of expressing dominance. So that means that you just tend to move more. Unfortunately, when you think about how video is compressed, essentially what you keep is all of the motion information in the video and nothing else. And so by just taking features from the compressed domain itself, it is also possible to express how kinesically active somebody is, at the frame level. So by taking features from both audio and visual domains and then fusing them together, then we're able to estimate how dominant somebody is with an accuracy of 91.2% for this. Well, it's quite a small data set. Yeah, I wanted to write the support vector machine part in here rather than here. The dominance annotations are the subjunctive part, just a bit like what you all did just now by putting your hands up and stating. So far, these are quite standard techniques. There's nothing really that new. But at the time when this was done, then we didn't really have any idea whether we would be able to predict dominance at all. If you were to look at that video, and because perhaps a lot of you guys were abstaining, then it suggests that we perceived these tasks to be quite difficult. The question is, are they really that difficult? And I'm hoping that throughout this talk, then you will see that there are still statistically generalizable patterns. So one thing I would also like to say is that if we were to just look at speaking time as extracted from automatically from these headset microphones, then we can already get a performance of 85.3%. So that means the person who speaks the most is labeled as the most dominant. And you can see here that there isn't actually that much of a difference when you consider that this is using a lot more different modalities. The question is, well, maybe we can just do with much fewer modalities and actually not lose that much performance. So another experiment we did involved asking the question, if we just have a single microphone in this meeting rather than a multimodal setup, then can we get better performance? Can we get equivalent performance? Now, in the case of a single microphone, then of course, for a given audio track, you still have audio which is captured of 4 different people. And how do you know who is speaking when? So this task is called speaker diarization, and essentially automatically segments and clusters the data based on who is speaking and when. I'm not going to go into details about the method, but I will show you an experiment later which essentially plays around with this structure. And ultimately, once you've got it to this stage where you have different speakers speaking at different times estimated from a single audio track, then we can again generate this binary audio signal, or like speech, non-speech signal, which we can then process in many ways to extract lots of different types of features related to the speaking. And then from that, we just took the person who spoke the longest and said, okay, that's the most dominant person. Okay. Now, that on its own is not very interesting. I think the more interesting question is, okay, so what are the trade-offs? If we have a single microphone system and we try to segment this audio track, then how can we do it in a way that is going to be robust and fast? So we experimented with 2 different methods. One that was, I'm just going to call it a slow method, but let's say it's slow and accurate. So basically, everyone and their particular segments of speech are very accurately estimated. In the other case, the audio track is just approximately clustered, and then the audio signal is then segmented using a much faster method. So let's say it's a quick and dirty method. We also experimented with different signal-to-noise ratios. So now we're just talking about, okay, is the microphone far away from the participants or close? Does that also make a difference? Oops. Oh. I think I'm stuck in a loop. That's not good. Okay, so you see here then the different microphone positions. Either it's in the middle of the table, people are seated in these 4 different locations, or it's on the lapel, or it's a headset microphone. And each one gives a different signal-to-noise ratio. To make a single signal, then for the cases of the headset and the lapel, then we essentially just summed the signals together to make a single audio signal, and then did the same clustering again. So I'm going to present first the clustering performance. What you see here on the y-axis is essentially the error rate in the clustering. And then on the x-axis, we see the signal-to-noise ratio as it goes from something which is quite high to quite low. So we expect in this case the performance to be worse because essentially the signal and the noise is less distinguishable, whereas in this case the signal and the noise is more distinguishable. And so as we expect, then the error is lower when the signal-to-noise ratio is high. And these three different lines represent the methods that I mentioned before: the segmentation when the method is very fast, segmentation when the method is quite fast, and the segmentation on the original clustering method. And as you can see, there's not a huge difference in performance. What is perhaps a little bit more surprising is that when we try to estimate the dominance of the most dominant person from the meeting based on these audio signals, based on the segmentation results I showed you in the previous slide, then what we don't see is that the accuracy does not improve as the signal-to-noise ratio increases. So here now we're just looking at the classification accuracy, so the higher the numbers the better. And you see much more of a flat profile. And again, the method of segmentation also doesn't matter. Oops. So, in summary, what this shows us is that it seems that the dominance estimation performance is not actually affected by the signal-to-noise ratio, and it isn't affected by the method used for clustering either. So even though the method for clustering gets worse, then the performance of the dominance estimation is still actually pretty good. And so one of the best methods that we had the fastest clustering approximation. And when we compare that, so here you see the numbers are around, let's say, the 75% accuracy mark, or down to about 70. The baseline case is 85. So with a single microphone rather than 4, where, I mean, getting worse performance, but you know, it's not actually that bad when you consider, practically speaking, that means you could just stick a single microphone in the middle of a table during a meeting and then still get pretty good accuracy. So from that, what we can say is that there seems to be very strong self-regulating behaviors in how people talk to each other, which means that even though our segmentation errors are actually worse, it doesn't affect the dominance estimation.
Sorry, can you explain what self-regulating behavior?
So self-regulating behaviors is, for example, in this presentation now, you guys decide that I'm, let's say, the more dominating person here and allow me to speak. So in a meeting, you would also do that as well. There's sort of some unwritten hierarchy that means that you won't tend to dominate over someone else, or they might not dominate over you if you already sort of feel beforehand that there is a hierarchy. Right, so in summary, then I showed you that if you were to look at both audio and visual features together, then you can get something close to 91% classification accuracy. With a single modality, then the performance is closer to 85%, and with just a single microphone rather than one microphone per person, then we get something like about 70% accuracy. So we can see that there's a trade-off, but ultimately it's quite interesting to see that even though you have worse segmentation performance, then actually dominance estimation performance does not suffer that greatly. Right, so again, this self-regulation seems to be important, and what surprised me when I was doing this work is realizing that, okay, now we're just down to a single audio source, and we're just looking at speaking turns, and there's nothing else. How can it be that, you know, something that seems so complex can be simplified to such a great degree? Are there other things that could be simplified? And so this is where I got curious about, well, attraction. I was fortunate enough to have a very keen master's student who helped to collect this data, had many friends who were single and needed dates. So I'm going to just rush a bit more briefly through this, but what I would say is that in this case, moving on from the slightly acted or less realistic scenarios of the meetings where volunteers just pretended to be in a meeting, in this case, we collected data in a real meeting, in a real speed date. This is a real bar on the campus of the University of Amsterdam Science Park. And these people are genuinely on a date. So going back to the social sciences literature, then we can say that we're not pulling this out of thin air. Attraction can be measured to some degree by things like behavioural synchrony or mimicry. So this tends to indicate levels of rapport or affiliation between people. Other things that people tend to do if they're attracted to each other is they tend to stand more close to one another, they smile more at each other, they orientate themselves towards each other. They tend to express more positive sentiment, like with head nods. And yeah, particularly, I guess, if you're sort of in your more flirtatious state, then perhaps you will tend to, move more flirtatiously. There is this classic example of the hair flick, the sort of thing where you do this, and why would you do this randomly? There's typically reasons for doing it. I'm going to talk about proximity and movement today, just briefly as a demonstration from what I showed you earlier. Again, we see a flow diagram, this time now with just video data. Actually, I wanted to have audio data as well, but unfortunately the master student working on collecting the audio data didn't manage to get it quite to work, so everyone was wearing phones that weren't collecting data. But that's the reality of these types of experiments. So we had video. And so the types of things we tried to estimate was the attraction levels. Would people want to exchange contact information? And we asked the dates about how they felt about how the date went and whether they were attracted to the person, and also whether they thought the other person was attracted to them. So I show you here essentially the top view cameras that we were using. From that, you can generate an eigen background, do background subtraction, k-means clustering on the binary mask to find roughly the regions of where people are. Unfortunately, there was a bowl of snacks in the middle of the table that you have to provide to people to make the mood more relaxed, and so that messed up a little bit with the centroid of the clusters. But what you end up with then is in X and Y a position of each person over time. And then from that we extracted a whole bunch of different features that either expressed just the individual's movement or how that person related to the other person. And you can see here in the top left-hand corner a sped-up video of some people having some dates. You can see that even though they're just standing, they're not really just standing. There's a lot of movement that happens. And actually, these movement patterns are quite important for us when trying to predict attraction. So here are the results. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of them, just to show you that basically we did try a number of different things. But what was perhaps most interesting, and by the way, we separated the males and the females when we did these experiments because from the social science literature, it's been stated that males and females have different reasons for choosing mates, and so we needed to keep them separated. And so this is why you see here performances for men and women separately. So one of the highest performing features is the variance in the position of the other person, so the other person that's in the date. So for example, in this case, that means that the variance in the position of the female is very indicative of whether that guy will be attracted to the woman. And in this case, the variance in position of the female is most indicative of whether she is attracted to the guy. Other features that worked quite well for men are synchrony features. Again, it seems to be related to the fact that the men need to see what the woman is doing rather than just being completely independent of the woman's behavior. And these are, you know, mirrored in findings from social psychology that state that men tend to be less picky because they just want to grab any woman who's interested, whereas women tend to be more picky because they will be carrying, you know, the genes of somebody who they need to make sure is a good candidate. So, one more thing I wanted to say is that these motion-based features, actually we tried to just compute the error on the tracking performance based on these features, and we found that the tracking performance was really, really poor. So what we found is that even though the tracking performance was very, very poor, somehow there was still something encoded in the movement that was still actually indicative. So the conclusion is that indeed, even from video with a top-down view where we can't see people's faces, then we can still predict attraction. Yes?
What are you actually trying to predict? Is this just a binary attracted or not variable? Did you get people to rate how attractive they found the other person on a scale from 1 to 9? Or?
We did do it on the Likert scale, but then I think so. And then afterwards we broke it down. Ultimately it was binary, the classification that was done. But it's true that it would be very interesting to look on the continuous scale.
How reliable a binary classification really is? How repeatable it is, if you like, if you've got...
That's a good question.
Once, would they agree with what they're saying?
So this was done with 8 guys and 8 girls over a very long evening. So actually I'm currently collaborating with social scientists, and we just did a massive recording of 100 people, so 3 events, about, well, just over 30 in each, to see if we can repeat this, but it's always a big question of repeatability.
Just a related question, maybe just a comment. It would be interesting to know how good people are if they watch the videos predicting the same thing, like third party.
Yeah, that would be really fascinating.
People have done similar studies with language and found
Yeah.
the machine classifies things to be
You're talking about the Ranganath study?
Yeah.
Yeah, perceptions of flirting. Yeah, I have a master student from psychology who'd be really interested in looking at that, but he's running out of time on his thesis, so we have a manpower issue. Yes?
Technical question. The variance in position, was that calculated from the centroids of the canines over windows?
Yeah, it was over a window, so it was the centroid was calculated per frame, and then a smoothing window was applied to the whole thing. Okay. Yep, so there are sex differences, poor tracking. Yeah, I've mentioned that. So again, there's something about movement behavior that can still tell us something about the way that people are interacting with each other, relating with each other. Right, so far I've talked to you about 2 different scenarios where people are essentially already know beforehand, you know, they're going to a meeting, they're going to sit there and they'll stay in that room during the meeting, or in the case of the speed dates, we know they're going to be there and not walk off. In reality, there are other types of situations where social interactions can occur, namely mingling events. And in these scenarios, it's not always so clear who's talking with whom, and so we need to draw on social psychology theories again to help us express what it means to actually be in a conversation with someone when it tends to be in this more freestanding scenario. So as you can see in the earlier parts of this video, you see this huddle of people with a shared central space. These are called F formations. There are also cases like this where somebody tries to enter a group but sort of doesn't quite make it. If you look at just the proximity information, you would say, okay, that person is probably in the same group. But in reality, there's a subtlety there that might actually be interesting for us to look at. Yeah, I was hoping to present you some work on this, but I don't know what the BMVC results are, so then, yeah, we submitted to BMVC. So I won't be saying anything about that, although hopefully it'll be accepted. So yeah, so it's very important for us to be able to know who's speaking with whom if we're looking at non-sort of pre-arranged meetings. And again, I show you this diagram of some data. This data was again real data that I collected in Switzerland of a real life, actually, it was a review meeting where 50 people showed up to present posters, and there were actually reviewers who were looking around the posters and looking at the people. In between times, people were drinking coffee and generally chilling out and interacting with one another. And so from that, we could basically annotate for who was talking with whom and who was sort of not quite in the group. The bit I'm going to show you about now is detecting who is talking with whom. So how can we decide who is talking with whom if we consider essentially position or proximity information? We can consider in a group of people that each person is represented by a node in a graph where the edges between the nodes represent how close that person is to somebody else. Now, if we phrase the problem in essentially a graph-based representation, then there are plenty of graph-based clustering approaches out there. The interesting thing is that actually in the social networking community, something that's very popular is called modularity cut. And so this has been applied in previous work in CVPR 2009, where using multiple cameras, they tried to predict who was talking with whom and whether there was a hierarchy within those groups. In that case, that was a completely, let's say, set up post scenario. And what I thought was more interesting was that actually when you go back to the definition from the social psychologists, they talk about this idea that you're sharing this space with a whole bunch of other people to the exclusion of others. And from a mathematical perspective, you can consider that to be a form of clique. And so in realizing that what we were looking at is not a cluster per se, but more specifically a clique, then the question becomes, how do we find a clique, a maximal clique, in an edge-weighted graph? Fortunately, there was a solution for this suggested by Pavan and Polillo, which basically they defined these cliques to be called dominant sets. And so a dominant set is equivalent to an F formation from social science theory. So in order to define these graph clustering methods, of course, you need to start with a table which represents how close is one person to every other person, so an affinity matrix, essentially. And the information we can use in order to describe this affinity is either proximity plus orientation, position, body orientation, and this other thing which I use to try and predict the body orientation from just the relative positions of people. So imagine that if you're in a mingling scenario and you're standing in a particular position, you're not going to be standing there at random. You will be standing there because you probably want to join a particular group, or you want to, well, try and avoid particular groups perhaps. And I found that by just essentially computing based on the position of other people over a Gaussian kernel, the center of gravity of the center of focus, I mean, of where a particular person would be looking, then it was possible to predict where somebody would be oriented just based on the relative positions of other people. So by using proximity and either orientation that is manually annotated or estimated, then you can construct an affinity matrix and then compute these dominant sets. I'm going to skip that now, I think. Yeah. So here's an example of the data. I'm still yet to use the dynamic element, but you can see that it's quite prevalent here. But you can also see that the spatial locations of people are quite clearly defined. Where's my mouse? Oh. Okay. So in terms of the F formation estimation performance, if we're just to use proximity and nothing else, then this is the performance that we would get using a modularity cut method. So this method that other social scientists have been using to look at community structure on the web. If you consider it in terms of a dominant set, so these cliques in a graph, then you get much better performance. If you use also orientation information, the performance improves further. And if you use just estimates of the orientation based on the relative position of other people, then actually the performance is not so good. The reason being that this graph clustering method already expects this kind of formation. So everybody who is represented to be in a clique with other people will already inherently have to have a certain orientation. So that estimating the orientation and using that actually doesn't really help that much. As a side note, estimating this error using relative positions gave some pretty good errors in orientation estimation, even though we're not using any kind of appearance-based models or anything like that. I can give you a bit more of an intuitive idea of what's happening. So given these three people that I've just zoomed in on, then using modularity cut, then this is the type of clustering that we get, because it's just looking for proximity and not this cliquey sort of state. In this case, using modularity cut and the orientation information, then that forces more strongly this clique structure, because it excludes people from being close to each other in the affinity matrix. But if we use this automatically estimated orientation just based on position information, then what you see is these yellow lines represent the orientation that's estimated. The red line is the true orientation. And you can see here that, okay, in these two cases it's pretty similar, whereas in these two cases it's a bit more different. In this case it's actually pretty off. But actually that doesn't matter, because geometrically speaking, it's not good if you have three people in a row like that. The fact that this guy in the middle is occluding this guy from possibly talking to get this guy means that it's impossible for these three people to be in the same group together. And so by applying even an automatically estimated position-based estimate of body orientation, then we can actually get a pretty good estimate of who's talking with whom. So in this particular work, by showing this, well, I call it local social context, because essentially we're looking at the relative positions of other people in these circular formations. You need to have the positions of everyone being around you for that group, that conversational group, to be detected. Then this is a sort of social context that's exploited in the modeling of the clustering, which actually gives us better performance. I also see that, okay, body orientation is still quite important for just looking at subtle differences in positioning that can make a difference in dense, crowded scenarios. But again, there is this sense that there's a strong self-regulating behavior. So the only reason why we can estimate where people are looking oriented based on the relative position of others is because somehow where I stand relative to other people and where they stand relative to me must be really important. Again, a sort of self-regulation. I think I'm running out of time. Got 5 minutes left. Okay, so what's next on this journey? Well, from the lessons that we've learned so far, then it seems that body movement is important. And this is something that I wanted to take on further by asking the question, in these dense, crowded scenarios like the one displayed here, how can we predict who's talking with whom? Even from just looking at the video now, this gets very complicated. Aside from that, typically people have done it with audio, but audio in these types of environments is very, very challenging. You can try to use indoor GPS with wearable sensors, but again, the density is a very challenging issue. And if we just look at proximity sensing, like for example, infrared signals, Bluetooth signals, then they typically tend to have a very high precision. But if you're standing side to side with somebody, then you won't detect that, it won't detect that you're talking to them. So drawing on this motion information, I questioned whether it would be possible to use that to actually predict whether people were talking together or not. It didn't come out so well here. Well, okay, so this is again another data set. Here I just show examples of observing people interacting and hopefully being able to tell who's speaking at what time even though you can't see their faces at all. So one of the first tasks that we tried out was with the idea that, okay, from guys who, what's happening? Okay, so from guys who've been trying to detect who's speaking with whom with audio, then they typically use the speaking turns to do that with. So we wondered, could we do something similar using the wearable sensor data, in this case acceleration? Sorry about this. Okay, next slide. So aside from looking at speaking, we also looked at other socially relevant behaviors that were occurring also within our data set. So then to do that, then essentially we firstly trying to predict who's speaking and when, or other socially relevant behaviors with just now a single accelerometer per person. So a single triaxial accelerometer hung around the neck. And then from that, then we try to predict the F formations based on looking at the mutual information between social actions. Like for example, if we were to look at two binary streams of speaking between two different people and compute the mutual information of that, and then essentially learn a threshold of what the mutual information should be if those two people are talking together, then does that already give us a good indicator of whether people are in the same conversation or not? Right, I'm going to skip that bit and just tell you that it's possible to predict speaking from just acceleration. So these are, by the way, accelerometers recording at 20 hertz, so we're not talking about anything in the range of normal speech. And so what I'm presenting you now is the results of F formation detection when we just take these estimated speaking status tracks, compute the mutual information, a threshold on that, and then try to predict whether people are talking together or not, with different window sizes, 20 seconds, 40 seconds, and 80 seconds. The random baseline is 50% in this case because actually these are very imbalanced classes, and so it's probably not a good idea to train the classifier using imbalanced classes, so we artificially balance the data. And the other important factor is that if we were to just compute the mutual information on the raw acceleration, then you see here that these values are not as high as the ones using the social actions. I should, by the way, say that this means social actions as taken from the ground truth, social actions as estimated with random forests. So you can see here that the performance is comparable to the ground truth, but definitely better than acceleration only. So I showed you results on the previous slide for just 10 people. Obviously, we're always talking about generalization, so we tried again with 26 people in a mingling event to try and predict whether they were talking together using acceleration only. This is where everything fell down, and we got basically random performance. And so then the big question is why? And so digging deeper into the results, then what I noticed is that if you're trying to predict dyads, then actually you get above random performance. So if there's only 2 people conversing in the group, then it's still possible within these 26 people to predict those conversing groups well, above random. But for groups that are of a larger size, it's not possible. So yeah, so this is all ongoing work. This is sort of where we stop at the moment, and where I need to spend more time working on it. I guess what I want to summarize with this particular part is that, speaking as a socially relevant behavior, and we can use accelerometers already to predict whether people are speaking or not, and with that, then we can actually predict if people are in conversations. Well, at least if there are 2 people in a conversation together. So what I have been doing is looking at training, well, rather than a universal model for all group sizes, then considering that different group sizes should have different models. If you think about that, it makes sense. If you have a larger group, you're probably going to be less involved in it. Right, okay, so I guess hopefully a message that I've put across with this talk is that even movement can carry something quite meaningful, even if we don't express it explicitly as a certain type of gesture. And even noisy sensors can still capture something meaningful about people's, well, attractiveness, how much they are attracted to others, whether they dominate each other. There's this strong self-regulating behavior, which means that almost people themselves are sensors, and we can use their behavior as a sensor for the people that they're interacting with. And yes, so I'm bringing in this honest signals thing just to say that, I mean, a lot of these behaviors, we consider ourselves to be very sophisticated animals that, can communicate in very subtle ways, but actually a lot of what we do is subconscious, and, well, one could say has evolved over time. And these things are, I think, cues that we can exploit when looking at computational methods for behavior. I have a whole bunch of open questions, but I would, I think, rather stop now and acknowledge a hell of a lot of people who contributed to the work I presented. Thank you.